From the nation's capital in Washington, D.C., Cole on Congress. The program discussing national issues that affect Oklahoma. Your host, U.S. Representative Tom Cole.
Thank you for joining me today for another episode of Cole on Congress. Today I'm pleased to welcome my good friend and colleague Walter Jones to the program. And Congressman Jones has been a representative for Eastern Shore of North Carolina since 1994. He currently sits on the Armed Services and Financial Services Committees. And I've asked Walter to join me in a discussion about, frankly, our national growing debt, our spending, and some of the things he sees from this critical position on financial services about the economy as it's going forward. But first, Walter, just thank you for being here. I very much appreciate you taking the time to come.
Tom, I appreciate it. You've been a man I have great respect for, your integrity and your leadership in the Republican Party and actually on the floor of the House.
Well, you're kind to say that. But I want to start actually so they get to know you a little bit and talk about your dad, because you're one of those unusual guys who's actually got a family history in this, and your father had a very distinguished service in Congress, and I'd like to ask you sort of how you got the idea of going into public life and a little bit about your relationship with him.
Well, Tom, thank you. My father served in the House for 26 years, became chairman of a committee that doesn't function any longer, known as the Merchant Marine and Fisheries Committee. At that time, they had quite a responsibility, but when we became the majority, I think they consolidated several committees, and that happened to be one. My father was a conservative Democrat from Eastern North Carolina, and actually he was one of the most unusual. He graduated from NC State back in the early 30s and worked as a salesman in Eastern North Carolina, and then actually became a recorder's court judge. You didn't have to be an attorney at the time. He was not an attorney. And then actually worked his way up through the State House, the State Senate, and then ran for Congress the first time against an incumbent, lost, but ran again and ended up serving 26 years in the House of Representatives.
Well, what did he think when you made the decision to go into politics as well?
Well, my father, I was actually in the mid-late 30s before I decided that I'd like to run for office, and that happened to be the State House of North Carolina. And my father and I used to have many interesting conversations, one that I think fits in with the title of your show today. I will never forget in the mid-'80s, my father was home in North Carolina. I went up on a Saturday afternoon to have conversation with him, and as we were talking, I said to my father, I said, why don't y'all in Congress balance the budget? We have a state law that says in North Carolina you balance the budget. And my father said to me, he said, Walt, he said, can you imagine how many people would be upset if you tried to balance the budget in Washington? And I said, well, then what are you going to do? You have a granddaughter, my daughter, who at that time was 12 years old. I said, what's her future going to be if we don't balance the budget? And he said, well, we'll just print more money. Well, Tom, that's been the problem that we've seen in your subject today, quite frankly. We can't keep printing more money because we know what that'll lead to.
Well, you came here with part of the original Republican Revolutionary class of 1994, and you really were part of accomplishing something I think a lot of people didn't think they'd ever see, which was 4 consecutive balanced budgets, a remarkable achievement, done in a bipartisan way with a Democratic president and a Republican Congress. So you sort of showed us that it can be done. Now, we've not been able to do it, obviously, under the Bush, and we're now in a period with President Obama. I'd like your thoughts on the level of spending that you're seeing now and what you think the prospects are going forward to repeat what you achieved earlier in your career and have a balanced budget.
Tom, you're right about the previous administration. They were not good stewards of the taxpayers' money. And even though I supported our nominee for the presidency when Mr. Obama won, I wanted to wish him the very best. And when he ran his campaign, I really thought maybe he'd be more of a centrist, not such a big spender. But then after he'd been in office 30 days, 50 days, all of a sudden all this big spending that I'm very concerned about, truthfully, that if we don't get a handle on this soon rather than later, I'm not sure there's going to be any hope later to control the spending, because we know that we owe the Chinese $800 billion. The Chinese 2 weeks ago made a statement, the finance minister of China, that maybe it's time not to buy America's debt. You know better than I what that will do to this country.
Well, let me ask you this. What do you think the consequences are of spending at this rate? What do you see if we don't get that under control? Can we do what your father suggested, just print the money? What are the consequences of doing that? What do you see happening to our tax structure down the road if we continue to spend at this level?
Tom, if we continue to spend, Ron Paul's a very dear friend of mine. I know he's a very dear friend of yours. And Ron Paul has said many times, when you print more dollars and put them in the market, nobody's earning the dollars, you're just flooding the market, then what's going to happen? Probably inflation will start raising its ugly head. My thinking, quite frankly, is if we do not get a handle on it now, I'm talking about this year, next year, and the year after that, I don't know how you can continue whether a Republican wins the White House or Mr. Obama gets a second term without having astronomical tax increases. You just can't keep doing what we're doing. I am probably more of a Pat Buchanan Republican than anything, to be honest with you. I've seen this country send its jobs overseas. I've seen this country trying to police the world, and I just don't think you can do either.
Well, tell me a little bit about the things you think we could do, maybe in the area of entitlement programs. We haven't really talked about that much. And to the president's credit, he's actually raised it a couple times, but I understand that Speaker Pelosi sort of encouraged him not to open that door. But I don't, personally know how you ever get control of spending until you sometimes sit down and deal with the really tough issues. Things like, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security have got to be brought under control as well.
Well, your point about both Social Security and Medicare are right on target, because Medicare really is the first one of the two that is in deep trouble, that could actually be bankrupt in the next 5 to 6 years. And I think that if the Congress, both parties, I want to see Ms. Pelosi reach out more to our leadership, and you're part of that, and say to the Republicans, we can't fix this alone. And I actually said this when we were the majority. We have to work together for the good of the people. I know that's true in Oklahoma. I know it's true in eastern North Carolina. And to me, if you continue to push the issues down the road for the next generation, then I have said this publicly, Tom, the next generation will curse those of us who did not deal with the problem now.
You're exactly right. We do see this happen at the state level. We've got in Oklahoma currently a Democratic governor. We have, for the first time in our state's history, a Republican legislature, Republican Senate, Republican House. They've had to wrestle with tough budget this year. About a 10-15% shortfall in revenues compared to last year. Didn't raise taxes. They just did the cuts. And actually announced a budget agreement last week, a week early. And so you see bipartisanship happen sometimes at the state level in these crises. Why is it so much more difficult here to achieve those same sorts of objectives?
Tom, I think one of the problems, quite frankly, is that there's too much money in Washington from the outside groups. I think they have too much influence in both parties. And I think that I joined John Larson recently. I've joined, at that time he was a Republican oil inspector. He's not now, as we know. And Dick Durbin with a press conference saying that we needed to look at options or alternatives to how we fund our campaigns. It would not apply to everyone, because those in office would continue, if they wanted to continue, or to raise money the way they do, or they would look at the option. And the option is trying to figure out some way, based on the Constitution, that we can negate so much influence here in Washington. To me, that's part of the problem.
Well, tell me about, again, you're sitting on financial services. I know on a couple of occasions there have been alternative Republican proposals on the budget. I'm sure we'll see an alternative Republican program on health care. There certainly was a Republican alternative stimulus package. How good a job is the Republican Party doing, in your opinion, at beginning to get back to the roots of fiscal responsibility, which frankly you've never left since you've been a member of Congress?
Tom, I think we've learned a valuable lesson, and I think we're beginning to understand that what we have to do is, where we can see opportunities to present our position and not being seen always as adversaries. I think there are times that the minority party, be Republican or Democrat, Republican in this case, you have to be adversaries. But there are times when the country is hurting so badly, and we are in America, it's hurting so badly that when we can find those opportunities to come together for the good of the country, we need to do it. Now, I want to be a little critical of Ms. Pelosi because I don't think she has opened the door as much as she should. I think to a degree, maybe the president, Mr. Obama, has opened the door a little bit wider than she did. But for the good of this country, people in eastern North Carolina, I certainly can't speak for Oklahoma, but when I go home on the weekends, as you go home on the weekends, people are saying to me, you know, we're hurting. What are y'all doing in Washington? Quite frankly, I think there should be more oversight on the bailout of Wall Street. I think we, both parties, have an obligation to find out those people who challenge the laws to take care of their friends. They should be investigated. I know there are some ongoing FBI investigations.
What do you think about a special oversight committee that would literally focus on either TARP money or certainly, I know to the president's credit, they've tried to put some controls on the stimulus money that's going out, and they've got an inspector general, and he's been empowered to do a lot of things. But again, our record, as you suggest, hasn't been very good in those areas.
Tom, I believe that there should be an oversight when you're talking about the billions of dollars that we use to bail out Wall Street and other banks in this country. I think the American people, the taxpayers in Oklahoma and North Carolina and across America, have a right to see where that money went and how that money was invested and spent. And I would love to see a Wall Street commission on the House side. I don't know how it should be structured. I don't know the politics of that, but I really think that Andrew Cuomo, the New York Attorney General, is really pushing hard to investigate how these dollars were spent in New York, and whether they were justified or not. And I think we have that same responsibility.
You know, and that ought to be something, honestly, at some level we could find a way to do in a bipartisan way, because the vote for and against it was bipartisan. That is, neither party could have passed it on their own, and frankly, those that voted for it felt we were in a national crisis, and I know they did what they thought the right thing was. I think those that voted against it felt the same way, and so it's actually one where the debate was actually of a pretty high level. That is, you didn't see the normal casting of stones and partisanship, and there was a real effort there. But I think there's a genuine desire, no matter which side of that debate you were on, to make sure that any money that was spent appropriately, is accounted for. So I actually think that could be one of the areas in which we could find a little bit of bipartisan cooperation.
Tom, I agree. I've actually, I'm one of the individuals, I guess that's why I said I'm a Pat Buchanan American, because I would love to see a moratorium on trade agreements. And I'm trying to get to the point that we were just talking about. Marcy Kaplan and I've had a very good working relationship. She's from Ohio. She's a Democrat. But trying to save American jobs, and that's just how we feel. But from that, we've had a discussion and felt that the Congress needed to do more in trying to say to the American people, we want to know how we spent your taxpayers' money. We want to know how it was spent on these Wall Street as well as in the banks. So I think there is something. Maybe you and I can talk about this when we get back from the memorial break, because to me, I think the American people would applaud a bipartisan commission to look to see how these monies are being spent.
No, I think without question, you're right. And when we've done that, and I saw Tom Davis with a lot of Democratic skepticism do a marvelous job of just that after Katrina. When we did a real oversight hearing and went back and asked a lot of tough questions, found out some things that went wrong, some things that went right, and learned a lot from it. I think will serve the country well. And I think some of our friends on the other side questioned whether or not Republicans would do that. I think Tom Davis in that case really did rise to the occasion.
He was an outstanding member. I hated to see him leave Congress, but Tom, I believe people like you and I won't say anything about myself, but you are a man of integrity. You're a man that people look at and know you're an honest broker, if I can use that term. And I think that that we really should look at the possibility of trying to get a bipartisan group together, because You know, I heard today when I drove in from North Carolina, my staff was telling me that, I don't know if it's the treasurer of California, but some leadership in California is asking this administration for TARP money to help bail out California.
Well, that certainly wasn't any place in the bill that was passed.
That's what I mean.
I think they've already done pretty well out of the stimulus package, quite frankly. Let me ask you this. You mentioned and you alluded a little bit to the amount of foreign debt. There was a time when we borrowed money, basically we were borrowing it from ourselves. Most of the people that lent the government of the United States money in time of war or deficit spending were Americans. That's increasingly not the case. A large portion of our debt is held by countries overseas, China obviously being one of the major ones, but certainly not the only one. What do you see as the consequences of that longer term for our country?
Tom, I think it just will add to the weakness of America, quite frankly. I think it's just ironic that I've been opposed to foreign aid ever since I've been in Congress, and I will tell you that when a nation like America has to borrow money from foreign governments to send foreign aid. Now, I'm sorry, that to me just doesn't make any sense. I'm glad to see you smile, because I'm telling you, when I mention this in eastern North Carolina, people say, well, have y'all lost your mind? You're borrowing money that you don't have to send overseas. Now, let me state that if it was a disaster of some sort, earthquake or whatever, I can see then we need to come together as the world to help each other out. But to have foreign aid, I mean, we borrow money from Mexico to help us pay our bills. And Tom, I think a disaster is headed. I don't want to be a prophet of doom, but I've listened, as you have, to experts on the debt. David Walker, former Comptroller General of the GAO, now with the Pete Peterson Foundation out of New York. And David Walker has been one of the strongest advocates of a nation that has to borrow money to pay its bills will not long be a great nation.
Well, I agree that a day of reckoning is coming, and frankly, I think it's more likely to happen sooner than later in terms of some of these expenditures. And I don't know how you feel about this bill, and we didn't have a chance to talk about it earlier, but I've signed on as a co-sponsor with the bill that Jim Cooper and Frank Wolf have offered, which would basically set up a bipartisan commission to look at our entitlement spending. Spend a year, anybody could testify. There'd be, the speaker would appoint some members, the minority leader of the administration, what have you, and they'd come back to us with an up or down plan. Now, it might not be I always tell people, if you want to get rid of a lot of congressmen, this is the way to do it. It's not going to be a happy vote. But, somehow, some way, we've got to force the institution to face up to the consequences of our actions. And if we didn't pass the bill, I think the debate would be worthwhile in terms of educating the American people what's at stake.
Tom, I totally agree. I think I did go on that bill as well and join you and Frank and Jim on that. I don't think we have the luxury of time. I hope I'm wrong. I really do. I hope I'm wrong. But I have said many times in my district, we're in the 11th hour of a 12-hour clock. And that's where I think we are. I have somewhat of majored in history. I wouldn't say I'm an expert. I didn't get a graduate degree in history, but I've watched this. I read the book, which I would suggest to some of you viewers, by Pat Buchanan, A Day of Reckoning. He reminds in the book history and how history parallels now with America. And it's a great concern to me, because that's why I will go back to this other issue. I don't think America can police the world anymore. Our troops are worn out. Our money we are spending more than we have, and our troops are tired. And I think you have to have a strong military. You've got to be smart. You've got to defend this country. You've got to go after those who attack America. But to go around the world and trying to create democracies here and there, it just doesn't happen if you review history.
Well, you've got a district like mine in the sense that you have a very substantial military presence, and of course you've sat on the Armed Services Committee for many years. I want to just tell our listeners, I had the privilege of sitting with you on that committee for 6 years, and nobody cares more about men and women in uniform than Walter Jones. I mean, I saw it in public and private sessions. Nobody stood up for the average GI, the average Marine, the average sailor and airman or Coast Guardsman more than you did in terms of the quality of care they would get, the pay and the benefits, the type of things that were needed for their family so they could continue to serve. And I think you've done your country a great service, and sometimes in closed meetings that nobody got to hear other than other members. And I admire you. I remember one in particular. We were talking about the condition of the Army, which, as you said, has been under enormous strain since 2002, when it was committed to combat in Afghanistan, and in 2003 in Iraq. You raised some really tough and good questions there. But toward that end, the one area looking forward in the president's budgets over the next 10 years where we're really pulling back is our military spending. And that's at a time when rightly or wrongly, we're committed into conflicts. Now, I don't know your feel, but I have very major concerns when I see the percentage of federal dollars going to the armed services going to decline from 20% of the budget to 14%. The percentage of our national wealth that we're spending on defending ourselves, which was as high as 9% when Kennedy was president, over 6% when Ronald Reagan was president, is now a little bit over 4%, and would drop it to 3%. I think that means you're going to be asking those soldiers that are still in the service to do that much more with that much less. And I have a great concern about that. I'd like to get your perspective on that.
I share
forward.
your concern, Tom, because my limited understanding of the Constitution is that we're required to have a strong military, a defense of this nation. And I think that the proposals, this is what again bothers me, because what is happening as the president is trying to find money for this program, that program, he's taking it from the military. I don't think this is the time to do that. There might be another time to review where we are and what we need to be investing in and what we need to be spending, but I don't think this year is the time to do it. I really do not. And so I'm real anxious, as you are. I am on the Armed Services Committee. You made reference to that. And Mr. Gates will have to come before the committee, and that process has already started, to explain his recommendations. It's going to be a very interesting 5 or 6 weeks as we build up to bringing the bill to the floor sometime in mid-June.
Well, I have a lot of respect, I think most people do, for Secretary Gates, but he's not a miracle worker. You know, he can only work within the budget that the administration and the Congress
That's right.
Decide to give him at the end of the day. And I think he's had to make some tough decisions. Certainly some, I got to tell you, I profoundly disagree with. I'm quite willing to look at the future combat system because there's some areas where clearly we have not made the progress technologically we wanted to make. But when you're doing things like canceling a new cannon, when we haven't had a new one really since the old Paladin in the late 50s and 60s, we've upgraded it, but we canceled Crusader. Now this was going to be the next piece, the non-light of sight cannon. That looks like it's in very serious jeopardy right now. I don't want American soldiers going into combat with anything less than the best technology in the world.
I agree. Tom, I think that just like we all know that when an administration makes recommendations, and certainly the Congress takes those recommendations very seriously, but I think that to make up the Armed Services Committee that you used to serve on, I think now with, it's always been a balanced committee. I think only on the issue of abortion did we ever really have, really fights, so to speak, or strong differences. But I think that this committee will come together and try to make the right decisions. As you mentioned, the issue of the cannon, I think we'll make the right decisions because the decisions we make today, we're talking about the next 10 or 15 years. And the world we live in, no matter how you might feel about policy here or policy there, we've got to be able to say to the world, we have a strong military. And right now, I'm not sure we can say it.
Yeah, I tell you, one of the other areas that concerns me greatly is what we're going to do with air power. I think the biggest single advantage American soldiers have had in over half a century when we've committed them to battle, they haven't had to look up. We've had so complete dominance of the air and such complete dominance of the sea lanes around the battlefield that we just have not had to worry about another power, and that's not necessarily going to be the case going forward. One of the things that does alarm me a lot is we're planning now for the war that we're in, and our enemies are certainly very formidable. But if you really look at what they're armed with, it's improvised explosive devices, it's AK-47s, and it's rocket-propelled grenades. It's not tanks, it's not artillery, it's not air power. You can't count on every adversary not being able to mount creditable armored forces and air forces to oppose you.
Well, Tom, just like China, I look at the what they have put since 1994. They have tripled their investment in the military in China. They read the newspapers, they have the intelligence, they see the TVs, they know that America right now, that our military is in a very stressed situation, both manpower and also equipment. And they are building an air force that truthfully, if we don't do something, as you said, to strengthen our air force, we're going to be challenged by China. I'm not saying so much in war, but I'm just saying to say our air force is equal to your air force. We cannot afford that to happen, in my opinion.
I think one of the big challenges we're going to have going forward, frankly, is right-sizing the military. Now, you and I were there in a time when, in a bipartisan basis, first with a Republican majority, but continuing under a Democratic majority, we, I think, appropriately increased the size of our Army and our Marines in particular. How do you see that going forward? Will we be able to achieve the goals that we set out, and do you think we need to go further?
Tom, I think that this is where the president has got to establish priorities, because I'll tell you something we have not had time to talk about, and that is the wounded coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq. It's going to be astronomical in cost to take care of these young men and women. And I think that what's got to happen is that the president has got to say we've got to be careful how we reestablish priorities. We're not doing that right now.
Well, I tell you what, I couldn't agree with you more. And, you know, you've been one of the really thoughtful guys in Congress in the time that I've been here, and frankly, have been the model of being a consistent conservative, and yet somebody that I think genuinely has the respect of members on both sides of the aisle. Another thing that I'm sure our listeners don't know, but they ought to know, Walter Jones was voted as the nicest member of Congress by the staff. Now, the staff really knows. Staff and the folks that service here and do such a wonderful job, they know who's nice to them and who's not. So you're looking today at the nicest guy in Congress.
Well, Tom, that's nice, very kind of you to say. I'm a man of very strong faith, and I try to live by what I believe God has asked us all to do, and that's to be fair with each other.
Well, I appreciate you being here. You made the time go fast, as I knew you would, Walter, but we're just about to wrap up, and I want to thank you. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Cole on Congress, and until next time, this is Congressman Tom Cole from our nation's capital. Thank you for being with us today. And Walter, thanks very much for coming and joining us.
Thank you, Tom.
It's been a great pleasure to have you here, my friend.
Thank you.